Margaret Wilson spent 15 years trapped in a pharmaceutical nightmare, taking every pill prescribed, following every doctor's order, yet her blood pressure climbed higher while her savings vanished and her body failed. The real villain wasn't a person, but a broken system that kept adding medications that didn't work, draining her hope and bank account with each failed treatment, leaving her convinced she'd follow her late husband to an early grave. Then a chance encounter at a farmer's market changed everything. A stranger named Dorothy shared a simple morning drink recipe that modern medicine had overlooked, and within months, Margaret's body began responding in ways 15 years of expensive medications never achieved. But just wait until you hear how this grandmother went from 168102 blood pressure on multiple medications to a perfect 120/76 on nothing but vegetables, proving that sometimes the most powerful healing comes from the simplest sources. The morning light filtered through Margaret Wilson's kitchen window, casting long shadows across the countertop where her blood pressure monitor sat like a silent judge. She reached for the prescription bottle with hands that trembled slightly, the orange plastic container feeling heavier than it should. 15 years. 15 years of this exact same routine, and yet nothing had changed. She turned the bottle slowly in her palm, studying the white label with its precise black lettering. Amlodipine 10 milliounts, take once daily. The pills inside rattled softly, a sound that had become the soundtrack of her mornings. Each small white tablet represented a promise that had never quite been fulfilled. A daily ritual that should have protected her, but somehow hadn't. The blood pressure monitor screen still glowed with this morning's reading. 168102. Margaret stared at those numbers, willing them to be different, but they remained stubbornly unchanged. Dangerously high. That's what Dr. Harrison always said. Dangerously high, Margaret. We need to get this under control. But control seemed like a foreign concept when she took her medication religiously, never missing a single dose, and her pressure still climbed to these frightening heights. She unscrewed the cap and shook one pill into her palm. So small, so insignificant looking. How could something this tiny be both her lifeline and her disappointment? Margaret swallowed the pill with a sip of water and sank heavily into her kitchen chair. The movement felt exhausting, as if gravity had somehow doubled its pull on her body overnight. Her fingers rose to her temples, where the familiar throb of a headache was already building. It would be a bad one today. She could tell by the way the pain pulsed behind her eyes, sharp and insistent. Tears began to slip down her cheeks before she even realized she was crying. At 63 years old, Margaret had imagined retirement would bring freedom, adventure, time with her grandchildren. Instead, it had brought this endless cycle of medical appointments, medication adjustments, and declining health. Her body, which had carried her through raising 3 children, building a career, caring for aging parents, now felt like a stranger. A rebellious stranger that refused to cooperate no matter what she did. The headaches came nearly every day now, waves of pain that made it hard to think, hard to concentrate on even simple tasks. Reading made her dizzy. Watching television hurt her eyes. Even conversations with friends left her exhausted. The dizziness was worse. Last week, she'd gripped the handrail at the grocery store, waiting for the world to stop spinning, while concerned shoppers asked if she needed help. The humiliation burned almost as much as the fear. Driving had become impossible. Her car sat in the garage, barely used anymore. Emily drove her to appointments now, when her daughter could find the time. Margaret hated being dependent, hated the burden she'd become. She saw it in Emily's eyes, that mixture of worry and helplessness that made Margaret's heart ache even more than her head. The fatigue was perhaps the cruelest symptom of all. It wasn't just tiredness. It was a bone-deep exhaustion that turned simple activities into monumental tasks. Getting dressed drained her. Making breakfast required rest periods. The retirement she'd dreamed of, filled with gardening and volunteering and traveling to see her scattered children, had shrunk to the confines of her small house and the distance between her bedroom and kitchen. Margaret noticed Emily's visits had become less frequent over the past few months. Her daughter called more often, quick check-ins that replaced the leisurely afternoon visits they used to share. Margaret understood. It was painful to watch someone you loved deteriorate, especially when they were doing everything right. Following every doctor's instruction, taking every prescribed medication, attending every follow-up appointment, and still getting worse. She wiped her eyes and looked around her kitchen. The morning dishes from yesterday still sat in the sink because she'd been too tired to wash them. The dining room table was barely visible beneath the mountain of paperwork that had accumulated there. Medical bills, mostly. The sight of them made her stomach clench with anxiety. Margaret rose slowly and walked to the table, her fingers trailing across the stack of envelopes. The top one was from the hospital, from her last emergency room visit 3 weeks ago, when her pressure had spiked to 1950, and Emily had rushed her in, terrified. 4 hours in the ER, multiple tests, medications administered intravenously, a cardiologist consultation, and a bill for $6,000, of which her insurance would cover only a portion. Beneath that were bills from Dr. Harrison, her primary care physician, Dr. Chen, the cardiologist, Dr. Patel, the nephrologist they'd added when her kidney function started showing concerning numbers, specialists upon specialists, each one running tests, adjusting medications, scheduling follow-ups. The cost piled up relentlessly, month after month. Her savings account, once a comfortable cushion she'd built through years of careful planning and modest living, was disappearing at an alarming rate. She'd withdrawn another $5,000 last month just to stay current on her medical expenses. At this rate, she calculated grimly, she had maybe 18 months before she'd depleted everything she'd worked her entire life to build. Margaret sank into the dining room chair, surrounded by evidence of her failing health and vanishing financial security. The pills were supposed to help. That's what she'd been told. These medications will protect you, Margaret. They'll keep your pressure controlled and prevent complications. But her pressure wasn't controlled. The complications were happening anyway, and now she was being bankrupted in the process. The doctors kept adjusting her treatment plan. First, it had been just the amlodipine. Then they'd added a diuretic. When that didn't work, a beta blocker joined the regimen. Still, her pressure climbed. An ACE inhibitor was introduced. The side effects from that one had been terrible. A persistent dry cough that kept her awake at night and made her ribs ache. They'd switched her to an ARB instead. More pills, more side effects, more expenses, more disappointment when her readings remained stubbornly elevated. She felt trapped in an endless pharmaceutical maze, turning down corridor after corridor, trying door after door, but every path led to the same dead end. Nothing worked, nothing changed. The maze just kept expanding, adding more twists and turns, more medications to manage the side effects of other medications, more complications from the very treatments that were supposed to simplify her life. Margaret stood and walked to the window, looking out at her neglected garden. The roses needed pruning. Weeds choked the vegetable beds she used to tend with such pride. She didn't have the energy for it anymore. The garden, like so much else in her life, had become another casualty of her declining health. As evening approached, Margaret found herself alone in her living room, the shadows lengthening across the worn carpet. The house felt too quiet, too empty. She picked up her phone, hesitating before scrolling to Emily's number. Her daughter was busy with her own family, her own job, her own challenges. But Margaret needed to hear a voice, needed to feel connected to someone, anything to push back against the isolation that threatened to swallow her whole. The phone rang once, twice. On the third ring, Emily answered. "Mom?" Her voice carried that familiar note of concern that had become standard in their conversations. "Hi, sweetheart," Margaret said, trying to sound stronger than she felt. "How are you?" "I'm fine, Mom. How are you feeling?" The question Emily always asked, the one Margaret dreaded answering honestly. Margaret's carefully constructed composure crumbled. "Terrible," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of everything she'd been holding back. "Emily, I don't know how much longer I can do this. The medications aren't working. I feel worse every day. I'm scared." The silence on the other end of the line stretched out, filled with all the things neither of them knew how to say. Margaret could hear Emily's breathing. When they said goodbye, Margaret set the phone down gently and sat in the growing darkness, not bothering to turn on the lights. She had followed every rule, taken every pill precisely as prescribed, kept every appointment, arrived early, asked the right questions. She'd modified her diet, reduced her sodium intake, tried to exercise when she had the energy. She'd been the perfect patient. And yet here she was, sicker than she'd ever been, watching her life savings evaporate while her health continued its steady deterioration. The doctors had run out of easy answers. The latest appointment had ended with Dr. Harrison looking at her chart with a slight frown, saying they might need to try a different combination, maybe add another medication to the mix, another pill, another side effect to manage, another cost to absorb, another disappointment waiting to happen. Margaret's thoughts drifted to Robert, her husband of 37 years. 5 years ago, he collapsed in their kitchen, a massive stroke that the paramedics said he probably never felt. Uncontrolled hypertension, the autopsy had revealed. His blood pressure had been high for years. He'd been on medication too, 3 different kinds by the end. It hadn't saved him. It hadn't even given them warning. Was she walking the same path? Would her children gather in some hospital room one day, being told that despite all the medications and all the monitoring, it hadn't been enough? The thought seized her chest with icy fingers, making it hard to breathe. She didn't want to die. Not like this. Not leaving behind medical debt, an unfinished life, and children burdened with guilt and grief. That night, sleep refused to come. Margaret lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through an endless loop of memories and fears. She remembered every appointment over the past 15 years, every time a doctor had adjusted her medication with confidence, assuring her this new combination would make the difference. She remembered believing them, trusting completely in the system, in modern medicine's ability to fix what was broken. That trust felt naive now, foolish even. She had given her faith entirely to a system that kept taking her money, kept adding more pills to her regimen, kept promising improvement that never materialized. The betrayal hurt almost as much as the physical symptoms. She had played by all the rules, and the rules had failed her. The despair pressed down on her chest like a physical weight, making each breath feel labored and insufficient. She was drowning in medical debt, drowning in failed treatments, drowning in a future that looked bleaker with each passing day. And there was no one to save her. The doctors couldn't. The medications hadn't. Her family loved her, but couldn't fix this. She was alone with her failing body and her depleting bank account and her mounting terror. Margaret turned on her side, pulling the blankets tighter around her shoulders, and allowed herself to cry. Not the quiet tears from earlier, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. She cried for the retirement she'd planned, but would never have. For the independence she'd lost. For the burden she'd become to her children. For Robert, who should still be here. For the woman she used to be, strong and capable and full of plans. Most of all, she cried because she didn't know what to do next. Every option had been tried. Every medication had been tested. Every specialist had been consulted. And still, her blood pressure climbed, her symptoms worsened, her hope diminished. She was trapped in a nightmare with no visible exit, and the darkness felt absolute. The next morning, Margaret forced herself out of bed with unexpected determination. Despite the restless night, something inside her refused to surrender completely. She decided to visit the local farmer's market, hoping fresh air might lift her spirits even slightly. She called a rideshare service, still not trusting herself to drive with the dizziness. The market bustled with Saturday morning energy when she arrived. Families, couples, elderly folks examining produce. Margaret felt like a ghost drifting through their world, moving slowly past colorful displays just to be somewhere other than her empty house. Near the organic vegetable stand, she paused to rest, pretending to examine tomatoes. That's when she heard 2 elderly women talking nearby. "I'm telling you, Martha, it's been 3 months and my pressure is completely normal now," one woman said excitedly, her voice carrying genuine joy. "No more pills, no more side effects, just that simple morning drink." Margaret's hand froze. Her heart suddenly began pounding. Blood pressure, normal, no pills. She turned slowly toward the women. "I'm sorry for interrupting," Margaret said, her voice shaking. "But what drink are you talking about?" The woman in the purple cardigan had kind brown eyes that seemed to immediately recognize Margaret's exhaustion and desperation. She stepped closer. "Oh, honey, you look like you need to hear this. I'm Dorothy." Her voice was warm, compassionate. "About 4 months ago, I was exactly where you probably are now, on 3 different blood pressure medications, feeling awful, pressure still too high." Margaret nodded, unable to speak. It was exactly where she was. "My grandson David studies nutrition at the university," Dorothy continued gently. "He told me about something his professor researched, a simple combination of beetroot juice, celery juice, and a squeeze of lemon, taken every morning on an empty stomach." Margaret felt her automatic skepticism rising. It sounded too simple. Dorothy must have seen it on her face. I know. "I didn't believe it either," Dorothy said, raising her hand gently. I thought if vegetables could fix this, doctors would tell us. But I was desperate, truly desperate. So I tried it. And it worked, Margaret whispered. Within 2 weeks, my pressure started dropping. Just a few points at first. By 6 weeks, my doctor was amazed and started reducing my medications. Now I'm completely off them, and my pressure stays around 118/76, better than it's been in a decade. Dorothy pulled out her phone. The science is real. Beetroot contains natural nitrates that convert to nitric oxide in your body, relaxing blood vessels. Celery has compounds called phthalides that reduce stress hormones and improve blood flow. Together, they work naturally on the same systems your medications target. Margaret stared at this stranger offering what felt like an impossible hope. I don't know. I've tried so many things. Dorothy squeezed her hand gently. What do you have to lose by trying? They're just vegetables. Keep taking your medications while you test it. Monitor carefully. If it doesn't work, you're exactly where you are now. But if it does... 20 minutes later, Margaret left with fresh beets, celery, and lemons, plus Dorothy's phone number and detailed instructions. That evening, Margaret researched everything. She found legitimate studies from major universities. Research showing beetroot juice significantly reduced blood pressure. Studies on celery extract and cardiovascular health. The science wasn't just anecdotal. It was measurable, repeatable, documented in medical journals. For the first time in years, Margaret felt a spark of hope. Small, fragile, but real. The next morning, she bought a juicer. Her first batch was 1 medium beetroot, 3 celery stalks, half a lemon. The taste was earthy and slightly bitter, but she drank it down. An hour later, she checked her pressure. 160/100. No immediate miracle, but she had an expected one. She continued every morning, refusing to let doubt win. Day 4, 16/298. Small but moving in the right direction. By day 10, 15/6/4, her headaches were becoming less frequent. By day 15, she had more energy than she'd felt in months. The reading, teeny 90. Emily noticed the change when she visited 3 weeks later. Mom, you look different. Your color is better. Margaret showed her the journal she'd been keeping, documenting daily readings, energy levels, symptoms. The downward trend was unmistakable. I'm still taking my medication, Margaret explained, but Emily, this is working. For the first time in 15 years, I feel like I have control. 6 weeks in, Dr. Harrison reviewed her readings with obvious surprise. Margaret, whatever you're doing, keep doing it. Your pressure has stabilized at 136/84. That's the best it's been in years. He reduced her medication dosage immediately. By 3 months, Margaret was on half her original dose, averaging 20/882. The transformation went beyond numbers. She felt lighter, clearer, more alive. She started morning walks again, visited friends, made plans. She was living instead of merely existing. The real test came at her 6-month checkup. Dr. Harrison stared at her chart in disbelief. Margaret, your pressure is 122/78. Your blood work is excellent. Your kidney function has actually improved. I think we can discontinue your medication entirely and monitor closely. Tears filled Margaret's eyes, but these were different tears. Not despair, but joy. 8 months after that farmer's market conversation, Margaret stood in her kitchen preparing her morning drink. She measured her pressure, 24/76. Completely normal. No medication. Just vegetables, taken faithfully every morning. She called Emily. Sweetheart, my pressure is perfect. The doctor says I'm healthier now than I was 10 years ago. Emily's voice cracked with emotion. Mom, I'm so proud of you. You didn't give up. Margaret looked at the juice in her hand, the simple ritual that had given her back her life. She thought about those dark nights of despair, the feeling she was doomed to follow her husband's fate. That darkness felt like another lifetime now. She'd learned something profound. Sometimes healing doesn't come from more intervention or complexity. Sometimes it comes from simplicity, from working with the body instead of against it, from nature instead of laboratories. Margaret didn't preach or push her story on others, but when people asked about her transformation, she shared what Dorothy had given her, hope and a path forward. Some listened, some didn't. That was their choice. The medication bottles still sat in her cabinet, reminders of where she'd been. But every morning, as she prepared her beetroot, celery, and lemon drink, Margaret celebrated where she was, free, healthy, alive in ways she'd thought were lost forever. The simple morning drink hadn't just lowered her blood pressure. It had restored her faith in her body's ability to heal, her power to control her own health, and her belief that even in the darkest moments, transformation was possible.